If you're interested in making a detailed platformer just like this one, within Gamemaker, using drag and drop, then keep watching.
G'day gamers, and welcome back to our drag and drop platformer series. Last tutorial we added some falling leaves to make our game feel more alive. In this tutorial I want to add the object that helped define platforming games, the collectible item. Whether it's coins to spend at the shop, random pieces of fruit, or that sneakily placed hard to get yellow star, they are an integral part of a platformer. So for our game, let's add a coin object for the player to collect. So let's get started. In the description, you'll find a sprites package and you'll be able to download that and unzip it, and that will contain the sprites for the project. What we're going to drag in is the s_coin image. So I'm just going to drag it into Gamemaker and that'll bring the sprite in. And I'm going to make sure that we middle center the origin for the coin. Now let's also make an object for that. So that's our sprite and that's right there. I'm going to make a object for that here. So right click, create object, and I'm going to call it O_coin. And make sure you assign the sprite. So if we look at our room, remember with our game we have enemies, and the enemies we jump on to destroy. So when the player jumps on an enemy, then I want some coins to spawn out of the enemy. And I want the coins to bounce on the ground and interact with our solid layer. So if you remember, we have a collision layer and that is where our solids are. So I want the coins to bounce onto that. So in order for the coins to bounce onto those solids, we need our collision code. And remember, we have a script for our collision code. So we can use those so we don't have to rewrite any code. And that's the great thing about using our scripts, is that other objects can use them. Now we also might want to create other objects later that also interact with the ground, whether it's a heart or something else that falls out and bounces on the ground. So because of that reason, I'm going to create a parent object. So right click, create object, and I'm just going to call it O_item_PAR, standing for parent. So we want to go down to parent, we want to look at the children, and we can drag our OCoin down here, and then that becomes a child of this object. And that means any code that we add for the parent is also applied to the child. So let's add a step event to the parent. And in here, I want to run the collision code. So let's go to execute script, and I'm going to select firstly the calc movement, because that will enable the gravity to be applied to the coin. And then we'll do a copy and a paste, and we'll also select the collision code, and that will enable it to bounce off the ground. So we've got our calc movement, which is working out our gravity and also applying some drag to the coin. And then we've got our collision, which will enable it to interact with the ground. Now, in order to use both of these, if I go into them, we have a calc movement. We're using things like VSP and HSP in here. So if we don't have those variables in the object, then we're going to get an error. So at the moment, this object doesn't know about VSP or HSP. We need to give those variables to this object as well. So under variable definitions, we want to create a HSP variable. We want to create a VSP variable. And we also need a drag variable. And here I'm going to set this to 0.96. And the drag is how fast it slows down over time when it's moving horizontally. So if you remember, in our calc movement, here's where our drag gets applied. So if we want the coins to appear when the enemy gets jumped on, let's go to where we have a player and enemy collision. So that's right here. And at the point where the enemy gets destroyed, let's go down and have a look. And that happens down here. We set the enemy to be in a dead state and we shake the screen. So at this point, let's spawn some of the coins. So I'm going to use the repeat function. So I'm going to drag that there. And then we're going to use our instance create. And how many times are we going to create them? Well, let's do an I random underscore range, and this will do an integer random value between two numbers. So I'm going to do it between 4, 6. So we're going to generate either 4, 5, or 6 coins at a time. Now here we want to create the instance, so let's select our coin. Now same thing for the X, I'm going to do a random range. So let's just do a random underscore range between -10 and 10. And that means they won't always spawn at the X of the enemy, it'll spawn either 10 to the left or 10 to the right. Now make sure you click relative because we're adding this value to our X. Now for the Y, I'm going to use a variable that is built into objects and it's called our bbox variable. I'm going to set it to bbox top. And that means it'll be the top of the mask for the enemy. So they'll spawn from the top of the head. Now we need to put it onto a layer. I'm going to create a layer and I'm going to call it coin. So that's all we need. Let's go do the coin layer. So I'm just going to put that just directly under the player. So I'm going to create a new layer here. I'm going to click on it and then press F2 and type coin. Now at the moment, when we create the coins, they're just going to fall onto the ground because the coins don't have any vertical speed. So let's change it so they have some vertical speed when they spawn. So let's go to our coin. And let's go to our variable definitions. Now we're inheriting these 3 definitions from our parent. That's why they're grayed out. So if you want to edit them, you can actually click this and you can make a change to them. I'm going to click this and I'm going to set our HSP, so that'll be our horizontal speed, to a random range value between -5 and 5. So it means it'll start out either moving to the left or the right or up, somewhere between -5 and +5. Now for VSP, I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm going to say random underscore range. And remember, a negative value for our VSP will move us up. So I'm going to set it to -6, -3. So we will move up when the object spawns. Now we've set up quite a lot. Let's see what it looks like in the game. I'm going to press play or F5. Now when we jump on an enemy, we should see the coins spawning. We do. And you can see that they move off the center of the enemy and they slow down over time. Same thing here. You get a screen shake and we get the coins spawning. Looks great. So what we need now is a way for the player to collect the coins. So let's have a global variable that we can use to keep track of the coins the player has collected. So I'm going to go into OGame and we're going to go to the variable definitions. And here we're going to add a new variable and it's going to be called global.coins. Now I'm putting it into OGame because this is actually the object that's going to draw the amount of coins later on. And I'm making it a global because that enables the player to easily access that variable. So now we need a way for the player to pick them up. If you look in the sprites folder, there is an scoin pickup image. That's the animation when the player picks it up. So I'm going to drag that in. And if you see, I've just drawn a little animation that plays when the player grabs it. So make sure you center the origin. And we're going to make an object for this as well. So right click, create object. It's called O_coin_pickup. And we're going to assign the sprite. Now when I played the animation, you might have noticed, if I go back to it here, you can click on one of these to edit it. It's always like a cross when it plays. So let's give some variety to that. Let's add a create event. Let's just go down and set an instance variable here for the rotation. So image rotation, and let's set it to random, and then in brackets I'm going to put 360. So that way we'll get some variation each time the coin is picked up. So the other thing I want to do is add an animation end. So go into other and go to animation end. So when the animation of the coin has played, we don't want this object anymore. We want it to destroy itself. So we're going to say destroy instance and just drag that in. So the idea behind collecting in this situation is that we have a coin object, and when the player interacts with it, it will change itself into an OCoin pickup instance. and then after it plays its animation, it'll destroy itself. So we need some code in here in the coin for when the player interacts with it. So we're going to go to collision and then collision with the player. And we're going to firstly increment the variable we have, and the variable is global.coins. And we're going to increment it by 1 relative. So that will add 1 to our total coins. And now if you type in change, you can actually have a code block that changes this instance into another one. And we want to select the coin pickup. So this instance will become the coin pickup, it'll play, and then at the end of its animation, it'll destroy itself. So let's test that out. So it works, but you can see there is a problem. All the coins get collected as soon as they touch the player. So what's happening is they are instantly spawning and then basically being collected by the player. So there's no time for them to bounce in the air. So let's correct that by allowing them to bounce on the ground first before we can collect them. And by adding a bounce to the instances, it'll actually make it look a lot better as well. So let's go into our oItem parent and let's have a new variable here. And I'm just going to call this bounce. I'm going to set it to 3. And bounce is just a variable that will allow it to actually interact with the ground before it stops bouncing. And then we'll use that to determine whether we can pick it up or not. So I've added it here and we're going to change the collision script so it accepts it. But if we do that, we've also got to go and change entity, because that also uses the collision script. Because remember, entity is the player and the enemy, and they also use the collision script. So if we are referring to the bounce variable inside the collision script, we've actually got to add it here as well. So I'm just going to call it bounce and just set it to 0. So let's go into our collision script and see where we can use this new variable. Okay, so we need to go look at our vertical check, which happens down here. And we need to see when we are setting our VSP to 0, and that's here. So it's this point here that we want to determine if we should set it to 0 or if we should allow the object to bounce. So right after we set our collide to be true, I'm going to have a check in here. And we're going to say if our bounce variable is greater than 0. So if our object still has bounces left, then what we want to do is not set VSP to 0. We don't want to stop the object moving vertically down. Instead, what we want to do is set our VSP to be half of itself, which means the object will fall and bounce, and if it still has a bounce variable greater than 0, it'll actually go up, and it'll only go up half of what the speed is that it's moving down. Now we also need to set this as a negative, because if our VSP is coming down, it's a positive value, and we want to push it up. We want to give it a negative value. And the other thing we want to do is look at our bounce variable, and we want to decrease it by 1. So it has less bounces now to do. Now if this is not true, I'm going to put an else in here. And if it's not true, well then just set VSP to 0. We don't want to bounce, then it can just stop. Now this is kind of tricky, so have a look at it, watch it a few times, and you'll see what's happening is we're basically just allowing the bounce to happen and bounce a little bit, or we're setting it to 0. So now over with our coin and our collision with our player, we don't want to allow this to happen if our bounce variable is still a positive. So let's look at this. Let's put a if check in here, and we'll say if our bounce is, let's say, less than 2, then we want to allow the change to happen. We want to allow the coins to be added, and we want to allow the pickup icons or pickup graphic to play. So let's test that out. Press play. So now we should have the coins coming out, and they actually bounce on the ground, and then we can collect them. Same thing here. And they've actually got a little bounce still, and we're still able to collect them because it has, we set it to be less than 2. That's great. So now we need a way to show how many coins have been collected. So let's have the OGame object draw that to the view. Now when drawing information like the amount of coins collected or lives remaining, you want the player to see them all the time. They should never be hidden by objects over them. And for those situations, we have a draw GUI event that will draw over top of the draw event. The draw GUI layer has its own resolution, so you can make the quality of what you draw there higher than the actual game is running at. So for us, let's go to OGame and let's add a draw GUI event. So add event under draw, and we want to do draw GUI. Now here we can draw the coins, and I want to draw the coins up the top left, how many we have. So let's create a font to draw with. So over here under the resource tree, I'm going to right click and say create font. Now you can choose any font you like to do this with. I'm going to call it firstly FNT_coins. And I'm going to choose something that most people on a Windows PC should have as a font. I'm just going to use, say, Bookman Old Style. And I'm going to set it to 30. Now, if you're using a font that's not a common one and unlikely to be on all PCs, you can copy it to the project, and that will then copy the font across to the project as well. But for us, that's fine. That should be a font that people on Windows will have. So now let's go back to our OGame, and let's have a look at our draw GUI event here. But firstly, I want to get the font. So I'm going to set the font. And there it is there. I'm going to select it. And then I'm going to set a draw color. So here I want to set draw color. Now I'm going to draw it in a yellow, and I'm just going to pick a yellow color. Let's just say like that. That's fine. And now we can actually draw the amount of coins. So if you type in draw, you'll see there's a draw value. And we have a caption, so I'm going to write coins there. And here's the value we want to draw. We want to draw global.coins and the position that we want to draw them at. Now up the top is 00 in the game, so I'm going to draw it at 22, which is just a little bit in, and 11, which is also a little bit down. So let's press play and see what that looks like. Great, so it's there, and when we collect the coins, the value adds up. Now, it looks a little plain, so let's dress it up a little bit. Now, we can give it more impact by drawing a shadow. Now, how we draw a shadow is if you think of this value being drawn and we want to have a shadow under it, then before we draw this, we need to draw a black version of this. So if I take that, copy and paste, and this time the one above we draw in black. So for that reason, I'm going to actually take a copy of the set draw color as well, copy that and paste that below. So this one here, we want to draw it in a darker color. So I'm going to choose black and then change the alpha value to something low. Press OK and make sure use alpha is set at true. So this will be our shadow, and then further down, we are then drawing on top of that the yellow version. So we need to have a little bit of an offset of the X. I'm going to move it left a little bit and just up a little bit. So let's try that, and you should see that the font will now have a small shadow, and there it is there. It makes it stand out a little bit more. So one other thing we can do to define it more is actually draw a black rectangle around that area, and that will just make that area stand out and define it as the area where we are showing the information to the player. So let's go here and let's set a draw color again. So let's grab that, set another draw color, and let's also set, say, a dark black with an low alpha, and this will be for our rectangle. Now we want to draw a rectangle. I'm going to drag that here. So when we draw the rectangle, what we're trying to do is draw a rectangle up the top here where we are then able to display our information. So we need 4 points for the rectangle. So when we go back here, the left is at 0, the top is at 0, our right is all the way over here. And the position of the right is actually, and I'm going to write it out, it's actually display get GUI width. And this will give us the width of the GUI. And the bottom is how far down. I'm just going to set it to 55. Now we want to fill that in. And if we press play there, we should get a little rectangle up the top that then we are able to see our values over. And that makes it feel a lot better. Now we're actually seeing an area up here that is defined as the GUI area. Now, the last thing I want to show you is that instead of writing the word coins, you can do what most games do, and that is to just draw the icon of the sprite that you're collecting. So as you can see here, I have an icon of the coins, and it also has a shadow on it, and it just makes it look a lot more professional. Now, if you're interested in how I did that, you can head on over to my Patreon account. That's a bonus video for Patreon members only, and I'll show you there how to add that to your game. Speaking of Patreons, if you want to support me, you can head on over there and become a Patreon, and that enables me to create a lot more content. These are my current Patreons, and I want to give a big shout out to Dylan Jackson, who became my first legendary Patreon. And as a legendary Patreon member, you get access to all of the bonus content, as well as the source code, as well as my existing courses and any future courses that I release on Udemy. So that's the end of this tutorial. If you want to create additional items in your game, you can use the same structure. You just take a copy of the coin object and then you make it into a new object, and that way it'll still be a parent of item parent, and therefore it'll still bounce on the ground and have all the same properties as the coin. You'll just need to have a collision with the player, and then you add the new code in there for whatever you want the object to do to the player. Now, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. That helps me to know that you enjoy the content, and it also helps me to create more. Put a comment down below showing what else you'd like me to do. And the last thing I'll mention is my Gamemaker course. We just had a Black Friday sale and we've had a huge number of people coming to the course. If you're interested in the course, it is the highest rated Gamemaker 2 course on Udemy. I actually have a section in there where I create a gem, and when the gem is collected, it explodes into all of these little crystals. It's a really cool effect. You can check it out on the intro video over on Udemy, and there's a special coupon code down in the description where you get over 90% off of the course. That's all for me right now. Thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you in the next one.